Hello, this is Dr. Stansel with a lecture on identifying objections. I'll be talking about identifying objections to philosophical arguments. So before we get into that, let's revisit the function of a philosophical argument. So the job of an argument in philosophy is to give rational justification for a point of view. Justification means reasons, evidence, or support, and rational means it is reasonable. It appeals to our intellect. Specifically, a philosophical argument states premises which support its conclusion. Arguments and objections play a central role in philosophy because the culture of philosophy is a culture of dialogue and debate. Usually, in the history of philosophy and as it's practiced today, we see these dialogues occurring between two participants, and usually the participants take turns in some kind of pattern that looks like the following or some variation of the following. Very typically, the first philosopher will make an argument, and then the second philosopher will respond by making an objection to that argument. And as you'll see in the rest of the lecture, an objection doesn't go off into some totally new direction. An objection actually digs into the first philosopher's argument and examines it critically. After the objection, philosopher one has a chance to respond to that objection and address it. And then typically, it's philosopher two's turn to make their own argument. Philosopher one then makes an objection to their argument. Philosopher two can respond to the objection. And then this pattern can repeat for as long as the two feel like it's still worth it to talk to each other. I'm going to get more specific now about what an objection is and what it is not. An objection to an argument is a critical examination of the argument. It expresses reasonable doubt about how the premises of that argument support the conclusion. What it is not. An objection is not simply doubt about the conclusion. If we're just expressing doubt about the conclusion of the argument and we're not talking about how the premises of the argument support that conclusion, then this is not a genuine objection. An objection is not simple disagreement with the conclusion. An objection is not a different argument for an opposite conclusion. I'm going to show you a sample argument, and then on the following slides, I'll show you three different objections to this argument, and I'll analyze each one of them and show you the elements of each objection and talk about how a good objection can be written up in a paragraph. So this argument is based on the work of George Berkeley, a very important Western philosopher who lived between the 17th and 18th centuries. This is his argument for idealism. Well, it's one of his arguments for idealism, which is a view that the physical world does not exist. It's all in our mind. The argument's in my words, but it is Berkeley's argument. Okay, it says, our philosophical views should be based on evidence. The only evidence we have of the world around us are sensory perceptions, visual perceptions, tactile sensations, sounds, smells, tastes. People naively think they are experiencing the world directly through their senses, but we only experience sensation through our senses. and sensations exist only in our minds. Thus, they do not provide evidence of a physical world that exists outside our minds. The real world exists in our minds only. So, this argument is based on the idea, first of all, that if we're going to form a view and hold a philosophical view, it should be based on evidence. And this is certainly a very compelling idea because we do want to have standards for our beliefs and for our views, and evidence is a criterion that someone must meet. You want to have evidence for your view. And then what Berkeley's doing in the midsection here is he's pointing out that the only kind of evidence that we have for the world's existence are just mental events. These are events happening in our consciousness. So when I see a chair, for example, and I'm looking at an office chair right now, and it's got black vinyl, and it's got metal supports and metal legs. But really, I'm just having a sensation in my mind at this moment. A mental event is occurring. And Berkeley wants to point out here that we have these mental events, these conscious experiences, and that those can't serve as evidence for a physical reality because a mental event and physical reality are two different kinds of things. They're in two different categories. They're like water and oil. It would be like having a dream. Maybe you dream that you have $100 in your wallet, and then you wake up, go look in your wallet. Are you definitely going to find $100 in there? Not necessarily, because dreaming of $100 and having $100 are two different things. Dreams shouldn't be used as any kind of indication of what our reality is going to be like. And very similarly to that, Berkeley is saying our conscious experiences, the mental events that we experience as conscious beings, should not be used as evidence for a physical reality, because the concept of physical reality is that it exists outside the mind. He feels it's a mistake to use mental events as evidence for something outside the mind. That's the argument. So here is the first sample objection, and I'll read through it. The argument says, our philosophical views should be based on evidence. And this is true, but the author fails to acknowledge how we can use evidence and reasoning together to draw reasonable conclusions, even about things we cannot perceive directly. Suppose a person lives alone with their cat in a place with no rodents or other pests. One night, they leave a bag of bread on the counter. They wake up the next morning to find the bag pierced with small holes the size and distance apart of a cat's claws. They did not see their cat attack the bag, but based on the evidence they have, they can infer their cat did so. Similarly, based on our sense perceptions, we can infer there is a physical world outside our minds. Just as the cat did it is the best way to explain the pierced bag, there is a physical world is the best way to explain why we perceive what we do, why we all experience similar sensations, why the world obeys predictable patterns, and more. And this objection is based on the work of Bertrand Russell. He made this objection to Berkeley in the 20th century. I'm going to analyze this objection first by talking about what it does. It refers specifically to a key premise of the argument. and that happens early in the paragraph. It argues that the author overlooked something significant related to that premise. Now, the key premise that is highlighted in the objection has to do with the importance of evidence. And then the objection goes on to point out that the author overlooked something important about how we use evidence in forming our beliefs. The objection then explains what the author overlooked and how it matters. So specifically, the objection explains that the author overlooked the idea that we can start with certain evidence, things that we did see, that we did touch, that we did hear, etc., and then use inference, which is a process of reasoning, to come to a reasonable and valid conclusion about something that we did not see. And the objection uses the example of the bread bag attacked by the cat. The idea there is that the person did not see their cat attacking the bread, but when they see the evidence, they can use inference and conclude, I think my cat messed with this bread bag. And in the same way, even though our sense perceptions are just sensations existing in our minds, we can still infer that they are caused by physical objects and that they indicate the existence of a physical reality. Finally, in the conclusion of the objection, it does argue for an opposing conclusion. So these 4 bullets under the what it does column are all important elements of the objection, and I would recommend you pause the lecture and go back and look at that objection and try to find where each of these 4 things happens. Notice what the objection does not do. It doesn't just attack the conclusion, and it doesn't just argue for an opposing conclusion. The objection gets into the content of the author's premises and talks about what the author included in those premises and related ideas that they left out. It's really important for an objection to stay focused on the premises of the argument, because the key issue here is how well the premises support the conclusion. When we're doing objections, our opinion of the conclusion itself is not that important. What's really important is our critical view of how well we think the premises work to support the conclusion. Let's look at a second sample objection. The argument states that our sensory perceptions cannot serve as evidence for a physical world that exists outside our minds, but they can. According to the principle of universal causation, everything has a cause. Our sense perceptions must have a cause, and once we have determined what it is, our sense perceptions are evidence that that cause exists, just like a rock falling is evidence that gravity exists. Berkeley seems to imply that our minds cause our perceptions, but if they did, everyone would see different things because each of us has our own mind. Also, we would not be surprised or confused by our perceptions if they came from within ourselves. It makes more sense to think that physical objects cause our sense perceptions by interacting physically with our sense organs. Here's my analysis of this sample objection. First of all, what it does. It refers specifically to a key premise of the argument, and it argues that that key premise is false. It explains why we should think the premise is false, and this takes up a good portion of the objection. Finally, it argues for an opposing conclusion. Now, each of these four elements is very important. I would encourage you to pause the lecture, go back to that objection, and see if you can find where each of these four things happens. Notice that the objection does not just attack the conclusion, and it doesn't just argue for an opposing conclusion. The objection gets into the substance of the argument by specifically examining a key premise. The objection provides very thoughtful, very detailed discussion about what's wrong with that premise and why we should think that premise is false. A couple warnings about writing this sort of objection. If you're going to do an objection where you're arguing that a key premise of the argument is false, don't just say that the author did not give enough evidence or support for that premise. Don't just say that many people disagree with this premise. I'd like to say a little bit more about the warning from the previous slide. And the reason is I do get a lot of student work that will make these mistakes, and I want you to avoid the mistakes. Don't just say that the author did not give enough evidence or support for the premise that you have highlighted. One reason is that when we're doing philosophy, we need to support our conclusions with premises. But the premises themselves don't need to be supported. They just need to be true. If we required that authors supported each and every premise with evidence and reasoning, it would make the readings way too long. So we don't do that. You will certainly see authors occasionally adding some extra support for a premise or two, but it's not required and it's not across the board. So what does this mean? When you're making an objection by attacking a key premise, the burden is on you to show that that premise is false. You need to explain what's wrong with the premise itself, address what the premise says, and show why what it says is wrong. Don't just say that many people will disagree with this premise. That's just not a good reason to think that something is true or false. If a lot of people agree with an idea, it doesn't mean it's true. If very few people agree with an idea, it doesn't mean it's false. The amount of support that an idea has in and of itself is not a good enough reason to endorse or not endorse an idea. So again, what you need to do is you need to examine what it is that the premise claims and discuss that, and discuss whether we should believe this claim, why or why not. Let's look at our third objection. Premises of the argument state that we do not have evidence that the physical world exists, and the argument concludes the real world exists in our minds only. But this is a leap. Even if all the premises of the argument are true, even if we have no evidence of a physical world, there still could be a physical world. Lack of evidence for a thing does not necessarily mean that thing does not exist. A better conclusion would be, we cannot know that the physical world does or does not exist. Let me analyze this third objection. It begins by summarizing key points of the argument, and it goes on to argue that the premises, even if they're true, are not enough to support the conclusion because the conclusion makes too strong a claim relative to the premises. And then the objection explains why. And so what it does here is it says, look, even if it's true, that we don't have, that our sense perceptions don't give us evidence of a physical reality, that doesn't mean that there is no physical reality. That conclusion is too great of a leap. The objection points out that just because we don't have evidence for something doesn't mean that that thing doesn't exist. So this form of objection, I want to point out, you might think that it's all about the conclusion, but it's really not. This form of objection shows that even if the premises are true, the premises are not enough to carry the conclusion. So this type of objection is really, it's about the premises and showing that there's a gap between the premises and the conclusion. The conclusion makes too strong of a claim. The premises aren't strong enough to support that claim. At the end of the objection, it argues for a different conclusion, a better conclusion. This is a conclusion that I felt when I was writing the objection could be supported by the premises. Again, what the objection doesn't do, it doesn't just attack the conclusion, and it doesn't just argue for a different conclusion. We've looked at 3 sample objections, and each one of them used a different strategy. And I wanted to create this slide for you where all 3 of the strategies are shown together in one place. So first, we saw an objection that showed that the author overlooked something significant, and that was sample objection 1. We saw an objection where the author argued that a key premise is false. That was sample objection 2. And finally, in the last sample objection, the strategy was to show that the premises are not enough to support the conclusion because the conclusion makes too strong a claim. These are 3 different strategies. There are different ways you can form an objection. When you write objections for me, I just want you to choose one of these ways for each time you do an objection, and you can use whichever one of these you want. So when you're reading an argument and you're thinking about how to identify an objection to that argument, you might have certain ideas and they might fit in best with this first strategy here. Or you might recognize something about how the conclusion makes too strong a claim relative to the premises, and so you might want to use the third strategy. What I'm saying is these are 3 possible strategies. You should choose one of them, and each time you write an objection for me, you can choose any one of these strategies that you want. And the choice you make is going to depend on how well you understand the argument you're reading, what ideas spark for you when you're reading that argument, and how your ideas can work into one of these strategies. All right, finally we come to our how-to slide, how to write an objection. So if I ask you to identify an objection and share it in a written answer, here's how you do that. Write an original paragraph with the following elements, and it needs to have each of these elements. First, refer specifically to a key premise or premises of the argument, or if you're using the third strategy, you can do a quick summary of the argument. 2, use just one of the following strategies. And these are the 3 strategies we talked about. Just use one. Do not use all 3. That's way too much work. It would be very unfair of me to ask you to do that. For a well-formed philosophical objection, you just need to choose one of these strategies and follow through. And that follow through happens here in step 3, explain adequately. I think if you'll go back and look at the sample objections that I gave in this lecture, And those are there to show you what a good objection looks like. If you go back and you consider how much of each of those objections was used for explanation, it's a third to a half of each of those paragraphs, and in some cases a little bit more. So step 3, explain adequately, is where you should be doing most of your work. Finally, step 4, argue for a different conclusion, and this may be an opposing conclusion or it may just be a different conclusion. And you'll actually see in the sample objections where I've done that, it happens pretty quickly. It's usually 1 to 3 sentences at the end. Finally, an important issue. What should you do if you agree with an argument? Well, I ask students to identify objections to arguments, whether they disagree with them or agree with them. And the reason is, in both cases, it's an important thing to know how to do. If you dislike an argument and you think it's off track, it's important to be able to identify its weaknesses so you can argue against it and get your reader ready for a better argument, namely yours. But if you endorse an argument, it's also important to be able to identify key objections to it so that when you move forward with writing your own work, you can develop something which utilizes the best parts of that argument, but which can overcome the objections you identified. So, identifying objections to the arguments we read is a very important skill, whether you endorse those arguments or not. Now, how would you write up your paragraph if you're identifying an objection to an argument that you endorse? I recommend you present your objection with a phrase like, an opponent might object, or one possible objection to this argument is, and there's certainly other phrases you can use, but you want something of that nature. And then in the paragraph itself, identify the best, the strongest objection possible. Be careful to not go easy on the arguments that you endorse because your score is going to depend on the quality of your work. So you want to find the best objection possible. And also, when we look at the goals of philosophy, if you're analyzing an argument that you really like, you want to find its biggest flaws. You want to understand what they are. And again, the reason is that as you move forward and develop your own views, you can take the best elements from that argument, incorporate them into your own work, but you can overcome the flaws that that argument had. Okay, so always identify the best, the strongest objection possible. Now, at the end of your objection, I want you to argue for a different conclusion, and that's reflected in the slides in the lecture. You should preface that with a phrase like, an opponent might argue that, or someone making this objection could argue. And on the last slide of the lecture, which comes next, you'll see sample objection 2. It's one that we've already looked at. I just took that and I added these signal phrases into that objection to show you how you could fit them in. And you want to fit in the phrases in a way that flows with the writing, and you'll see how I did that. And then as you're writing your own objections, if you end up objecting to an argument that you agree with, you'll want to fit these phrases in a similar way, make it readable, make sure it still flows, but it allows you to signal to your reader that, hey, I like this argument, but an opponent might object, da 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 da. I'm going to go ahead and read through this for you in case you're just listening to the audio of the lecture. And what we'll see is that my signal phrases an opponent might object that it doesn't come at the very beginning. I had to put it in a place that made sense, and let's see how I did that. The argument states that our sense perceptions, quote, cannot serve as evidence for a physical world that exists outside our minds, end quote. But an opponent might object that they can. According to the principle of universal causation, everything has a cause. Our sense perceptions must have a cause. And once we have determined what it is, our sense perceptions are evidence that that cause exists. Like a rock falling is evidence that gravity exists. An opponent might argue that Berkeley seems to imply that our minds cause our perceptions, but if they did, everyone would see different things because each of us has our own mind. Also, we would not be surprised or confused by our perceptions if they came within ourselves. It makes more sense to think that physical objects cause our sense perceptions by interacting physically with our sense organs.